On the Isle of Wight, researchers have been looking at the transgenerational impact of environmental factors like parental smoking by monitoring the welfare of a group of children as they grow into adults and go on to have their own children. Professor Hassan Ashad is the director of the Asthma and Allergy Centre on the island.
My research interests are primarily to identify the genetics and the environmental risk factors that are important in the development of asthma and allergy. And we now know that these generational effects do not stop at one generation. For example, studies show that if the grandparent is smoking, then that effect can be seen not only in their children, but also in the grandchildren.
Her granddad smoked in the house because that was the thing to do at that time. You don't think about it affecting your own child at the time, being in that environment, you know.
But it's quite scary. It can affect you and then me and then my baby, though.
You can almost see where, that thought comes from. People assume it's all fresh from when Kaylee's baby starts. You just think, oh, that's another generation. Anything anybody else has done isn't going to affect apart from mum. But it was also the environment.
We have a cohort of children, about 1,500, who have been very well studied over 18 years. We have the genetics information, we have their environmental exposures, and they are now getting married and having their babies. And what we want to show is that, okay, well, we know that this period is important for their future health, but how important and how it is done. So how the parents' exposures and parents' genetics affect the child's risk of allergies and asthma, and then we will follow these children up, hopefully, into their adult life to see all the effects being transferred through the generations.
And that transfer comes from both parents. The woman's nutritional state and her lifestyle may have the biggest impact on her children's future because of the key developmental stages that occur during pregnancy. But that doesn't mean Dad gets off scot-free. The Isle of Wight study is just part of recent research suggesting that a father's diet and lifestyle are important too. Anne Ferguson-Smith.
Interestingly, there have been a couple of recent studies that were actually done in animal models that suggested that there is a contribution from the father's environment on the development of the baby. And this is very surprising because, of course, the baby doesn't actually see the father apart from being derived from his sperm. So this raises the issue of the influence of the environment on sperm. So a study in which males were fed a high-protein diet, and when the female was fertilized by their sperm, a normal female that's seen no compromised diet, she gave rise to offspring that have a propensity for diseases like obesity and diabetes. So Dad's diet seemed to affect his sperm.
There's no reason why, if the maternal genetics and epigenetic changes are transferred, there's no reason why the paternal genetics and epigenetics would not be transferred. So we do believe that if the father is exposed to cigarette smoke or pollution, then that would make changes, transient changes, into the father's genetics. And when the child is conceived, those changes could also be transferred to the child, which will partly determine the child's risk of the disease.
But a better understanding of the processes involved could mean that these epigenetic changes might one day be reversible, allowing doctors to undo some of the damage.
We are hoping that once we investigate these mechanisms, how this can happen, we can find a way to reverse these, because the genetics cannot be reversed, but what we call epigenetics, that is the changes in the gene, transient changes induced by the environment, if we study those and know exactly where those changes are occurring, we can hopefully reverse those changes so that we can prevent the child from getting those diseases.
One of the really great things about these epigenetic changes in terms of how we think about the onset of these diseases is that these epigenetic changes are potentially reversible. So ultimately, one day it's plausible that we may find therapeutic targets and reverse the changes that are set in stone early in life.
But presumably to do that, we'd have to know exactly what these stresses are doing to the way genes are read now. I mean, do we understand it fully?
As yet, we understand actually very little about what's going on.
Understanding how our genes work and how our genes respond to the environment, I think, is, from an intellectual point of view, very exciting. But of course, what is much more important is that it helps us understand the molecular basis for disease. And in that way, we can both design new therapies and new drugs. We can take preventative measures to change our lifestyle, should we choose. We have more choices as to how we live our lives and to how we influence the lives of our children, which is perhaps more to the point.
Oh, in those olden days, where things used to seem so magic.
The concept that your grandparents' diet and lifestyle can exert some inheritable influence on your own health in adult life may be hard to grasp, but the mechanism may not be as complicated as inherited epigenetic change. There's another, more direct link, namely the egg that made you, which was formed by your mother when she was still inside her mother's womb. So, the egg that you came from is likely to be at least 20 to 30 years older than you and would have shared the same environment as your grandmother. David Barker.
Your life began when your mother was in the womb of her mother, and at that point in time, the egg that made you, when it was fertilized many years later, was laid down. But that is when your journey began. And it's an example of our ignorance that if you ask the question, so a little girl carries all the eggs that she will ever shed. What happens if that little girl is undernourished? What happens to the quality of those eggs? To which the answer is almost certainly negative things happen, which affect the quality of her offspring. But it's almost totally unstudied. So if you want to think about my life, I'm 70 years old, and my life began 100 years ago because the egg that made me was laid down when my mother was in my grandmother.
So the nutritional status of a woman is not only directly influencing the development of the child that's within her, but also the eggs that are within that developing baby that will go on to form that woman's grandchildren.
Yes, that is exactly right. And if you want to understand the geography of chronic disease across Europe or America, you have to bear this 100 years in mind. So the good news is that if we start to get this right, we will benefit many generations. The bad news is that there isn't a quick fix, but then there isn't a quick fix for climate change. It's just some things you just have to take on.
When a woman is developing in the womb, her own ovaries are being made, and the womb in her body is being made with all the arteries and glands that it needs to bear children after she is born and grown up and become an adult. So if you get the picture, every generation passes on nutrition to the next, and the nutrition that flows into the womb over those first 1,000 days are really determined by the previous 100 years, and that's the nutrition of the grandmother and the mother.
So who's this?
This is Max.
And you are Mum, so your name is?
Emma.
Emma, and
I'm Dean.
And your dad?
Yeah.
I'm Grandma, Dean's mum.
Dean's mum. And
I'm Leanne, Emma's mum.
Emma's mum. Right, so 3 generations here. So, Leanne, you're Emma's mum, Max's grandmother. What year were you born in?
68.
68. So was that here on the island?
Yeah, in Cowes. I was born in the bedroom, and the midwife lived down the road.
One of the interesting things that we realise now is that while you were in your mother's womb, that's when you formed the egg in your ovary that created Emma.
Wow,
so although Emma was not in your mother's womb, obviously, she was influenced.
That's amazing, really, when you think about it.
This field of the developmental origins of chronic disease came to pass because 25 years ago, we here in Southampton in the MRC unit were asked to try and make progress with the problem of why do poor people in poor parts of Britain get more sickness. And that is a paradox in relation to coronary heart disease, because coronary heart disease comes into nations as they become more affluent, but then the disease settles among the poorer people. Now, it's not because poorer people have too much of the good things of life, so there has to be another explanation. And in places where there is a lot of heart disease in the north and west, they are not characterized today by having people who do anything particularly different to people in the south and east. So we then reasoned, well, if the people in the north and west of the country get more heart disease, and it's not because of something they're doing now, maybe it's because they're more vulnerable. And once you start thinking about vulnerability, that takes you back to 70 years. And then once you start thinking about, well, life actually, if you're 70, you've been around for a lot longer than 70, you've been around for almost 100 years, then you start explaining why places in the north and west, which 100 years ago were deeply impoverished in many ways, have heart disease today. And that works perfectly in America.
Some people have talked about the fact that in the United States we had a Great Depression in the 20s and 30s, and during that time many people were malnourished, and we're still paying a price for that. And if you go back 150 years, people in the South where heart disease and stroke and diabetes are rampant, their malnutrition goes back to the Civil War, and it's never gotten back on track. And so what that tells us is that if we want to have healthy society, we have to think long term, which we're not used to doing. We have to rethink the way this is going to operate in the future years.
All the cardiovascular disease in America is in the south and east of the country, in the deep south. They're not doing anything different today than anybody else is doing. Go back 70 years, you're going back to a time when the south was poor. But if you go back 100 years, you're going back to the aftermath of the Civil War when there was famine.
And it's a legacy of those times.
Yes. And so what young women's diets today are doing is writing the map of Britain in 100 years' time in terms of illness.
That map may have already been written for us, but while we can't change the past, we can learn from our legacy and help write a better future for our children, and their children, and their children's children.
I don't think we need a revolution, but we need a relook at how health works. And I think people don't think about that very much. They just think about whether they get sick or not, and they don't think about the larger picture about how communities together have certain accesses to food and care for each other and the stresses that people suffer. All of these need to be looked at in the medical model so that people who are trained in medicine can help people realize that they need to live healthy lifestyles and look at nutritional flow over the next 100 years in order to completely reverse a downward spiral in health that we're seeing now.
The First 1,000 Days, A Legacy for Life, was presented by Dr. Mark Porter. The producer was Erica Wright. And you can download this programme and the rest of the series as a podcast from the Radio 4 website under Medical Matters.
The Reith Lectures continue with the former Director-General of MI5, Eliza Manningham-Buller, on terror, security and freedom.
It was also a rather welcome opportunity to think about what I really thought about these issues. Since I retired, I've been preoccupied generally with other matters, and being invited to do the Reith Lectures has given me the chance to think about what I really believe about these key issues and describe them.
The BBC Radio 4 Reith Lectures, next Tuesday morning at 9 o'clock.
This is BBC Radio 4. It's 5 o'clock. Time for PM with Eddie Mair.
It's the